Australia is a land of contrast. It's enormous, beautiful, wild, and almost empty. It's the only continent on Earth that belongs entirely to a single country, and that country looks absolutely massive on the world map. Yet despite being almost the size of the United States, the number of people living there is, putting it mildly, surprising. Australia is home to just over 26 million people. That's actually fewer people than live in the state of Texas, which has around 30 million residents. For comparison, Germany, a country dramatically smaller than Australia, has over 84 million people. The difference is striking. Despite its enormous size, Australia remains one of the least densely populated countries on Earth. And it gets even more surprising. There are individual islands around the world that have more people than the entire Australian continent. Take Java in Indonesia, for example. The island is about 6 times smaller than Australia, yet it's home to around 150 million people, almost 6 times Australia's population. And that's just one example. Great Britain and Madagascar also have populations larger than Australia, even though they occupy only a fraction of its territory. On this continent, kangaroos can actually outnumber humans. Even some cities beat Australian population. Tokyo, Delhi, and Jakarta each have more people than the entire continent. So, why is that? The answer lies largely in geography. Most of Australia is dominated by the Outback, a vast desert interior where living conditions are extremely harsh. Because of this, about 2/3 of Australians live in just 5 major cities: Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, and Adelaide. The rest of the country is made up of enormous, sparsely populated landscapes where encountering another person can be rare, and where kangaroos and emus roam far more freely than humans. To understand just how empty Australia can be, consider this. East Pilbara, a region in Western Australia, roughly the size of Japan, has fewer than 10,000 residents. Half of them live in a single town called Newman. And it gets even more extreme. Near Adelaide, a city of about 1.3 million people, there is a region roughly the size of France, inhabited by only 3,750 people. That's like spreading a small rural community across an area the size of an entire country. Or take Anna Creek Station, the largest cattle ranch in the world. It's bigger than Israel, yet only 8 people live there. The rest of the population, about 10,000 cattle. So the question remains, why is Australia so empty? A lack of water, extreme heat, and difficult terrain make it hard for people to live far from the coast. That's why around 85% of Australians live near the ocean. The interior of the country is a completely different world, one that only a small number of people are willing to face. But the desert is only part of the story. The real explanation for Australia's tiny population comes from a combination of geography and climate, creating what could almost be described as a natural curse of the continent. Much of the problem comes from Australia's unique position on the globe. Its relative proximity to Antarctica exposes the western side of the continent to cold ocean currents flowing north from the Southern Ocean. These currents reduce evaporation, which means fewer clouds and less rainfall. As a result, much of Western Australia is dry and infertile. Meanwhile, along the eastern edge of the continent lies the Great Dividing Range, a long mountain chain stretching across most of Australia's east coast. But despite its length, these mountains aren't high enough to trap most of the moisture coming from the Pacific Ocean. Because of this, the land west of the mountains lies in a massive rain shadow, receiving very little rainfall. And there's another factor. Australia sits close to the Tropic of Capricorn. This means its northern regions fall within the tropical climate zone, while much of the rest of the continent lies within the subtropical high-pressure belt. This system acts like a giant atmospheric dryer. Warm air rises, but often not strongly enough to cool and form rain clouds. The result is a continent where drought has been a constant reality, especially across central, eastern, and southwestern Australia. Australia is the driest inhabited continent on Earth. Deserts and semi-deserts cover more than 35% of its land. If you look at a rainfall map, one thing becomes clear immediately. Rain prefers the eastern coast. the areas along the Great Dividing Range, the tropical north, southern Tasmania, and the region around Perth. Interestingly, these areas almost perfectly match the places where most people actually live. But there's one place that breaks this pattern: Northern Australia. Rainfall there is abundant, but extremely unpredictable. The city of Darwin, the largest city in the region, receives more than 1,800 millimeters of rain per year, far more than any major cities around the world. But there is a catch. Almost all of that rain falls during just 4 months of the wet season, from December to March. Australia's history shows just how extreme this can be. In 1898, a tropical cyclone brought 740 millimeters of rain in a single day. That's more rainfall than some places receive in an entire year. But the opposite can also happen. In 1924, when the cyclone stayed away, the same area received only 4 millimeters of rain for the entire year. Less than that falls in some of the driest deserts on Earth. But unpredictable rainfall isn't the only reason Australia struggles with water shortages. Another major problem is the lack of large rivers that could provide a stable water supply. The country's largest river system, the Murray-Darling Basin in southeastern Australia, is incredibly important for millions of people. Yet from the perspective of building a large civilization, it has serious limitations. First, most of its water flows southwest towards the ocean, bypassing many of the regions that need it the most. Second, much of the basin lies behind the Great Dividing Range, where rainfall is already scarce. Despite these limitations, the Murray-Darling Basin supplies drinking water for about 3 million people and supports a huge portion of Australia's food production, food that feeds not only Australians, but also millions of consumers across Asia. However, there's a growing problem. Over time, droughts have become more severe, and climate change is accelerating the drying of rivers. 9 of the 10 hottest years ever recorded in Australia have occurred since 2005. Higher temperatures mean faster evaporation, while lower rainfall means some sections of rivers disappear for months at a time. And the challenges don't end there. Australian soils, especially in the north, are frankly terrible for agriculture. The continent has not formed major mountain ranges for nearly 1 billion years, and glaciers last shaped the land around 300 million years ago. In comparison, soils in North America and Europe are only a few thousand years old, making them far more fertile. On one hand, Australia struggles with droughts and irregular rainfall. On the other hand, the country actually has about 492 cubic kilometers of renewable freshwater resources. For comparison, many countries with much larger populations have far less water available. When it comes to farmland, only 6% of Australia's land is suitable for agriculture. That may sound small, but in reality, it's still an enormous area, larger than the total farmland of many countries. Even compared to parts of Southeast Asia, such as Indonesia, Malaysia, or Vietnam, Australia has more agricultural land than those countries combined, despite the fact that they are home to over 500 million people. Another major reason why only 26 million people live on such a huge continent lies in Australia's history. For thousands of years, Australia was like a lost island, isolated from the rest of the world. While Europe sat at the crossroads of trade routes and migration paths, Australia drifted alone, far from other continents. The first humans arrived here around 50,000 years ago, using a land bridge that once connected present-day New Guinea and Australia, a prehistoric continent known as Sahul. People were able to walk across this land, avoiding vast ocean crossings, but around 10,000 years ago, rising sea levels flooded Sahul, isolating Australia even further. As a result, a unique world developed on the continent, one dominated by animals like kangaroos and koalas. But this isolation didn't apply only to animals. For tens of thousands of years, the continent's first inhabitants, Aboriginal Australians, remained almost completely separated from the rest of the world. For most of its history, Australia was essentially a closed world. Its isolation and harsh environment made it a difficult place for large civilizations to emerge. Unlike in Europe, Asia, or the Americas, in theory, it could have happened. In practice, the continent constantly challenged human survival, requiring extraordinary resilience and adaptation. Even though Australia was extremely isolated, there were occasional signs of outside contact. One example is the arrival of the dingo, wild dogs that today are closely associated with Australia, but are not actually native to the continent. They appeared around 8,000 years ago, most likely brought by travelers from New Guinea. Another clue lies in genetics. Around 11% of modern Aboriginal Australians carry genetic markers linked to South Asia, suggesting contact with people from India roughly 4,000 years ago. Still, for centuries, the continent remained largely unexplored by the outside world. That changed in 1606 when the Dutch explorer Willem Janszoon reached the coast of Australia. At the time, however, the land was considered unpromising and not worth further exploration. But events soon followed that would change the continent's history forever. In 1656, a Dutch ship called the Virgule Drake wrecked on the western coast of Australia. 75 people survived the crash, but only 7 attempted that 1,400-kilometer journey to Java. After 41 days, they reached Jakarta and alerted the authorities. The people who stayed behind were never seen again. The story of the Virgule Drake survivors became one of Australia's many enduring mysteries. It wasn't until 1788 that the British established the first permanent settlement in Australia, in what is now Sydney. For a long time, Australia remained the least populated continent on Earth. Everything changed in 1851, when gold was discovered. A massive gold rush followed. Within just a few years, roughly 2% of the population of the British Isles migrated to Australia, causing the population to double rapidly. For a moment, it seemed like Australia was entering a golden age. But after the gold rush faded, immigration slowed again. Countries like the United States, Canada, Brazil, and Argentina were much closer to Europe, making travel easier, cheaper, and often more appealing. Then, in 1901, Australia introduced a controversial immigration policy known as a White Australia policy, which restricted immigration largely to people of European descent. For decades, immigrants mainly came from the British Isles, making Australia a largely European society. The world, however, was changing. During World War I, Australia lost thousands of young men. Nearly 1 in 5 soldiers who went to fight in Europe never returned. By the 1930s, Australia's population still had not reached 7 million. The country was isolated and surrounded by powerful nations, including Japan, whose population in 1940 was roughly 10 times larger than Australia's. After the bombing of Darwin in 1942, Australia began to fear invasion. Even though a full invasion never happened, the government realized that increasing the population had become a matter of national security. Immigration quickly became a priority. After World War II, Australia began opening its doors to migrants from across Europe. War refugees from countries like Italy, Greece, and many others arrived in large numbers, seeking safety and a better life. Eventually, a major turning point arrived. In 1973, the White Australia policy was officially abolished. Race was no longer a factor in immigration. Australia embraced multiculturalism. Today, in the 21st century, Australia is one of the most multicultural countries in the world. Most new immigrants now come from Asia, especially China and India, and it's easy to see why. Australia is a blend of cultures, traditions, and cuisines. Over the past decades, the country has welcomed millions of new residents. Today, nearly 1 in 3 people living in Australia was born overseas, one of the highest proportions among developed countries. And Australia isn't slowing down. By 2050, the population is expected to reach around 36 million people. But growth brings new challenges. On one side are the ancient problems of nature: unpredictable rainfall, droughts, unreliable rivers, and vast desert landscapes. On the other side is the accelerating impact of climate change, which will likely shape how people live across the continent in the future. Despite these challenges, Australia has managed to thrive. The country is actually one of the world's major agricultural producers. Australia is home to over 100 million sheep, roughly 4 times the number of people living there. It is one of the world's leading producers of wool and also a major exporter of beef and agricultural products. Even with its difficult climate, Australia's enormous land area gives it huge potential, making it a key player in global agriculture. Australia is a country of striking contrasts, full of opportunities, yet shaped by enormous challenges. Despite its harsh climate and great distance from other continents, it remains one of the most fascinating places on Earth. Its landscapes, wildlife, and culture continue to attract and inspire people from around the world, and the future of this remarkable country still looks incredibly promising.